privileged to introduce to our audience tonight my friends Cody and Casey Akin from Fort Worth, Texas. I've known Cody and Casey for at least 15 years. My first recollection of these guys was them coming to a Lone Star Region NMRA convention out in Irving and bringing a couple of replica number boards that they were making at the time. So I happened to acquire a number board that they had made for 486, a replica for 286, and then they show up with a replica of a plate for RGS 20 that they had cast in resin and painted. Just outstanding pieces of work, and several of the items that are very proud part of my collection. But Cody and Casey do more than just make number boards. They are scratch builders to the nth degree. They model in 1/24 scale, and they will talk about that this evening. So I'm going to let Cody and Casey come on board, share their screen, and show us what they've been doing.
All right, very good. Well, thank you, Mark. Show of hands. Who had a model railroad running around their Christmas tree when they were younger?
I see a lot of them.
Yeah, that looks like a lot of people there. All right, most of us probably. Well, that's how we got started into trains. As young as I can remember, we were into trains because of that. We've always been into large scale trains because of that. Because we had the LGB train that ran across, had 2 or 3 cars, and we ended up tearing that thing up. But every Christmas we loved getting it out. My father, Dave Akin, was an S&3 modeler to some degree, a collector, maybe more than modeler. That is how we got into narrow gauge. He took us in 1989 to Chama, and that was about all it took. We haven't looked back since. So today we are going to show you a little bit about what we've gotten into since we were kids. And mostly we'll be looking at this model you see here. We model in 1/24 scale. Well, what is that exactly? Most of your large scale stuff will run on G gauge track, which is 45 millimeters. It seems to be very toy-like sometimes because you have several scales that run on the same track: 120.3, 122.5, 124th, 129, 132. All of these represent a different wheel gauge, such as narrow gauge or meter gauge. But in a way very toy-like, because you could have a 1-20.3 narrow gauge locomotive sitting next to a 1-29 standard gauge locomotive on the same track, and your 260 narrow gauge locomotive is larger than a big boy. So it was kind of toy-like. So we didn't like that. We liked working in scale. That's what led us into 1/24th fine scale.
There was several companies that tried to start a 1/24th fine scale in the 80s. Companies like Precision Scale, Akin Craft was part of it. Trackside Details. Anyway, it didn't really go that way. They figured out that it was cheaper or more likely for people to buy larger 120.3 narrow gauge trains to fit the track they already had than to buy a whole new train, track, and everything. So it was squashed very shortly after. What we model in is 1/2 inch to the foot. That's what 1/24 scale is. We have a true 1.5 inches or 3 foot scale between our rails. It's smaller than 120.3. There's no track commercially available, very few ready to run models, very few detailed parts. Pretty much it's a scratch builder scale.
Not really a good name for this scale. Various things have been thrown out throughout the years. Obviously S scale, or HON3 being, a smaller scale, 1/87, I think. Yeah. One S scale moving up to 164.
O scale,
1/48, and then you get into the big boy stuff, and so we kind of coined our own name here. We call it CN3. When you get into a size this big, you can see pretty much every detail. So they all have to be there if you want to pass the judge's eye here at these NMRA meetings. So that was a little joke we came up with. Hopefully somebody's laughing. I can't hear. But
so our first car, our first real 124th scratch built project, this was about 1996. It was a project I started. It was a stock car. It originally was going to be a string of stock cars. You can see in the top left corner, that's some of the bodies that I built. As time progressed, I wanted to enter this in the 1996 narrow gauge convention, and I ended up only making one instead of the original 10 that I started to make. You can see the detailed pictures before it was painted. This is a good picture. It was actually our car painted on top. And then this is a 120.3 scale narrow gauge stock car from AMS on the bottom, and our car sitting on top. That's just a good size comparison of the two different scales.
you can see the 124th is slightly smaller, and that we thought was a benefit to, you know, being able to do a little bit more, a little tighter curves. 1 to 20.3, as you see on the bottom of the bottom stock car, is significantly bigger and almost more toy-like still to me, but that's kind of why we went with this scale.
This is the car painted. This is actually after the convention. I took second place. To show you how little time we had for the convention, the car was painted about 2 days before the convention. We took the unlettered car to where was it? Colorado, Durango. Right. And it was lettered in the United Campground parking lot on a picnic table the day before we entered it into the contest. So here's a good picture of the prototype. And then there's our car sitting. While we were in Colorado, we decided to just take a picture of the model with the prototype.
It's always neat to let the model visit the prototype for sure.
Yeah.
All right, so if you're going to scratch build, you got to have a locomotive if you're going to be in a scratch builder scale, because there's very little available unless you have $3,000, $4,000 to buy something that Precision Scale came out with in the early 80s. We did not. So this began the process of how do we make a locomotive ourselves. Also, we started out with the RGS 42. Just because it was such a decrepit looking locomotive towards the end, it was pretty rough shape. So we figured if we messed anything up, it would fit right in with the prototype. Started out by, finding all the pictures we could, scouting for plans on the internet, and looking for scale drawings as much as we could.
We also took some of our own pictures, took some of our own measurements, found this was pretty much all the plans we could find. There's a folio sheet, a crude drawing, and a precision scale in cab detail. And then I took those. I've been drawing in CAD since about the late 90s. I took a high school course on CAD, drew up a set of plans, and this is only a snapshot of the set of plans. I had ended up drawing several different generations of this locomotive. But this is the one we chose to go with. It's the 1951-52, actually during the scrapping process version of the locomotive.
Unfortunately, that's the one thing that Casey does remember from high school is how to draw on CAD. So I'm thankful for that. A good friend of ours, and probably a few of y'all, I've recognized some names. Mr. Barry Bogues always taught us that he likes to start with the tender first when he's scratch building a locomotive. It gives you a nice, easy square box to start scratch building, and once you finish that, you should be fully motivated to finish your locomotive. So that's exactly what we did.
This is basically just a 60,000 styrene tank with some pipes, PVC pipes sectioned for the corners, some angle line or plastic angle reinforcement for the inside. The tender trucks were built by strip styrene, heating and bending, gluing, all that. They're designed to come apart. You can see the little snap ring on this picture over here on the right, so that we can disassemble and reassemble should something need to be fixed, something breaks, lubricated, what have you.
I should say these are actually masters for a resin mold that we will actually make these for. we planned on doing several locomotives, so we thought it'd be a good idea to make one master and cast them.
This is the casting after the fact. You can kind of see inside of here, there's actually brass reinforcement strips. The tender gets really heavy with all the battery and electronics inside of it, so these things need to be supported.
And this is a clear casting resin, what you're seeing, so you can actually see through this stuff when it hardens, and it's very useful for finding air pockets within the casting. Casting resin tends to be very brittle, and if you have any air pockets in there, it will be a weak point for breaking. Coming together here on the under frame of the tender, these were some cast wheels. We ended up finding some metal wheel sets available through Precision Scale, actually in 1.5 gauge, surprisingly, and they're still available in their catalog today. Some of very few parts that are, but you can see that's all coming together.
Tender's coming together. I left this slide in specifically to show these red areas. When we originally glued these patches on, so on top of the 60,000 layer styrene, we have 10,000 layer patches of styrene to simulate the real courses of the tender, the different layers. And there's embossed rivets. And yes, I counted them. Yes, they're all there. But they were put on in layers to simulate the different patches. Well, we used an MEK based glue to glue these on because we didn't want them to come off. What we didn't realize is when you come back several hours later or the next day, that MEK eats through this 10,000 layer. So we had to spend a lot of time, and you'll see it even got worse on some of the next pictures, but we had to spend a lot of time filling these gaps in, sanding them down without trying to knock off the rivets.
The red you see is actually some squadron putty, and yes, getting in between there and trying to sand all that out without taking off all your rivet detail, because once you take off an embossed rivet, it's now a hole.
Yeah,
and you would pretty much have to start over, and that's what we tried to avoid. It actually worked out okay, fortunately. A little more detail here. The back headlight bracket, the tender fill spout was all formed out of brass and soldered. The ladder was formed out of brass and soldered. I don't think there were any commercial parts on this other than the KD coupler. Took it outside just to get some sunlight on the picture. This was probably shortly before paint. Also stuffed inside is an 18-volt battery pack, an air wire card, which actually allows us to run this remote control, and a tsunami and a speaker. So even in a larger scale, by the time you stuff all that in there, it is it's pretty tight.
this is an early rendition or picture of the plugs. The plug on the left is actually a tsunami for all the lighting and sound, and
That's a soundtrack plug, I believe.
right, or soundtrack, excuse me. The plug on the right was a 1/8" stereo jack that we were using for our motor driver, but we ended up changing that to an Aristo style plug because it was just too stiff and it actually would cause the engine to derail. And then next we went into the engine.
This is a very early form of actually 315, it says there. So Scott, wake up. We ended up not going with the C18 because we wanted to do a one-off engine, and we picked the 42. But this is an aluminum frame. We tried various different materials for a frame. Aluminum being very soft, bent too much. We weren't happy with it. We even had one water jet cut out of steel, but we just couldn't send the little micro drill bits through the steel without breaking several bits, and those things get pricey. So we ended up making it out of brass. So I believe this is another C18 frame here, actually, but just shows you kind of how everything went together before all the details were added. This is a front shot with a pilot wheel. This was turned on a lathe out of aluminum, one of our very early first lathe projects.
Some of these detail parts that you see there in the off-white, that's just a 2-part resin. Any of the stuff that that needed to go on multiple locomotives, we just cast in 2-part in the resin so that we could make multiple ones.
I should say this cylinder jacket that we made, you see here, is actually out of an aluminum can. We did that so we could crunch it up like the prototype was, make it look like it'd been hitting rocks and trees and people and whatever else they run over.
This is just a picture of how our driveline was originally intended to sit. You had a motor into a drive shaft into a gearbox. Then there was a timing belt that ran from the rear driver to the front driver. And what that was supposed to do, this locomotive had plastic side rods. It was supposed to transfer the power from the front and the rear so that there was no stress on these actual side rods. It ended up being too stiff and it wouldn't allow the engine to flex and move like it needed to.
I should say on these pictures that you're looking at, we're kind of glossing over some stuff, but anything in the bright white you see is usually styrene. And anything in this off-white yellowish color is casting some resin we've made. It was an early on, it's a quick set resin. It's not the clear stuff like we ended up using later on, but that's what you're seeing basically.
These are the journals, the original journals. The original journals are that clear resin, and there's actually a tab on the top of the front and rear that was supposed to maintain a solid footprint on the ground or on the track so that the flange drivers, because the center drivers are blind, were always on the rails. And then the center drivers were just allowed to float up and down. That way, if it ran over something, it didn't pick the engine up and cause it to derail.
In later versions, we cut this tab off right here and actually installed a coil spring so that all the wheels can move. As per the prototype, if anything's too rigid, it's going to come off the track, and we definitely found that out. The wheel centers are cast a low melt metal, and ironically or surprisingly, you can cast that in a rubber mold.
Silicone.
Yeah, rubber is probably good up to around 400 degrees if I remember, and this stuff was around 280, I think, to melt. So we melted it in a my dad was an old bullet reloader, so we just loaded it in his reloading pot there, melted it down, and then spooned it in. This is the driver center that you get out of that mold. Found out it's very soft. The machine's great, but pressing axles in there tended to be a challenge, because if you're not very careful and straight with that axle, it will hog out that metal, and then you get a wobbly wheel. Frame with wheels put in. You can also see the driving belt in here, and that is something we did say that we ended up doing without. The tires are cut on the lathe out of aluminum, and those are pressed on the finished centers. A lot of lathe work involved in getting tires put on.
Mm-hmm. Couple of trial and errors too.
Oh yeah, you'll definitely mess some of those up when you're a lathe rookie. Boilers coming on the frame here. This has a real oak pilot beam. 42 at one point had a snowplow on it, so that's why you see this wedge cut front. This is actually fit the plow, and the bolt that went through right here at some point had blown out. So we tried to model any of those little details we could.
You can see the plastic side rods. The boiler itself is a solid shell. There's actually styrene wrappers wrapped around it to simulate the jacketing, and then the step brackets, air pump brackets, and what have you actually bolt to the inner shell to show the depth, because that's kind of how it was in real life.
It basically allowed us to recess anything we wanted to into the boiler and make it look like it had a jacket over it. Little practical joke I'll go through. This was something Casey came home to one day. You might notice a cup of Dremel cutoff wheels. This was a copper pipe off of some project, capped to a spray paint can, and the lid to a pen here. I texted Casey and said, when you get home, you'll see a finished model. And this is what he came home to see. So a little laughable moment there. More details added. These are Delrin domes, a Delrin smokestack, all turned on the lathe. And I believe we ended up casting those as well. So those were just one-offs. You can see the Coca-Cola cylinder wrapper here made out of a Coke Zero can. Took it outside for a little daylight, so you can pick up some of the details on that front end, and it's starting to come together.
This was pretty much one of the last pictures we took of the model before it went into paint. This is pretty much final assembly. All the details are on, everything's working. Ran some test runs. there were several modifications we had to do afterwards, but this is pretty much what it looked like before paint, which is where we're at.
That brings us to paint.
Yeah.
Disassembly is first. Every attempt was made to make this locomotive able to disassemble for repair, or it was a very trial and error process. We wanted to be able to take it apart, and that came into play when we realized we don't like plastic side rods. So we ended up having to take most of this apart to fix that and fix a U-joint that went bad on the drive line. So anyway, this is it's very handy to be able to take a locomotive apart, and everything gets primed. And when you're as good with an airbrush as me, you prime your fingers too. So don't shake an airbrush.
Adding a little color.
Yep. Front got painted silver. I usually paint light to dark, so the lighter silver got painted, and then the dark. And here everything sits on the table ready for reassembly. A little interior detail shot here. The white you're seeing is actually athletic tape cut into 1/8 inch strips wrapped around brass piping. So it very nicely resembles insulated pipe, I thought, and it came out really well when we weathered it down.
This is the locomotive after painted. It's kind of mocked up because we still have to take it apart to do some more stuff, but this was before it was lettered. It was the first time we got to see it all assembled and painted. First locomotive we built, first locomotive we've really painted. So it was an inspiring moment for us.
It is a very exciting moment when you see it's hard to cover up all that hard work with dirty, grimy, nasty black paint, but it's a neat moment when it starts looking like a locomotive. A couple of detail shots here that we actually posted some of these on the forum, the narrow gauge forum, asking, does anybody know what locomotive this is? And there were several guesses before somebody, I think, finally saw the bell and said, I think that's a model. But we did definitely pull the wool over a few people's eyes. You can see some cinder detail there, and everything gets weathered that we do. We like them dirty. Nice backhead view with the fire door there, and cab curtains I think they're just typing paper. I primed with like some Kills primer and just wrinkled them up, tried to make them look like beaten up cab curtains. Interesting note about 42 towards the end. Ironically, this locomotive configuration was used in scrapping. We didn't really know that when we were looking at pictures of it until we got through with the build, but it actually borrowed 3/17 tender. So we laser cut out of masking tape a 3/17 stencil, hand painted it on there, peeled the tape off, and then painted over that 3/17 stencil with black paint. So down here you can actually, the idea being you can actually still see the letters through the paint, because we found one picture of the rear of this locomotive and they had done that, and thought it was a neat detail. There she is out in the sun. I think we were taking some of these photos for the Narrow Gauge Gazette. This was featured in one of the years. And you might say, why take such a cruddy picture of a prototype 42 in Durango? So that you can let your model visit the prototype. I don't know how it started, but it's a thing with us now. So everything we build, we try to let it visit the prototype.
We then went into a little later on a second locomotive. There's only a few pictures of this because most of it's the same. There are a few changes we made. Same basic concept: take measurements, find plans, draw plans, take pictures, find pictures. And then here is the tender completed. You can see those PSC metal wheels that we were able to procure on the actual trucks. This is a neat detail of how we bent flat brass stock. You just mill slots in it with a Dremel cutoff tool, and then you can fold it over, solder that joint so it fills it in, and then file it smooth, and it really turns out well. It's almost impossible to notice once you get some paint stuff on it.
Neat little technique if you ever need to bend flat brass. And I think she's ready for paint here. We'll just skim through this 318 because it's very similar, but we just wanted show a couple of pictures here.
One thing we did change on this was these are stainless steel tires. We got away from the aluminum because, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
The aluminum, I believe it was picking up on the side of the rails, and it was causing it to run off the rails.
Aluminum wheels on aluminum track. It's better to have a harder tire and a heavier tire. We found out. You can see the clear cast smokestack here, and these are castings we made from 42, I believe. And you might recognize the Anheuser-Busch cylinder cover for 318 there. We might have had some liquid motivation there that day.
These are metal 3D printed side rods. Shapeways was a company we did this. The first set was in steel and it actually shrank, so they were unusable. And then we had them printed in bronze, and they come with this kind of texture that just takes polishing and cleaning, sanding and grinding to get rid of, but they turned out really well.
Yeah, in the end, you'll save a lot of time. This is not something I really wanted to try to do on a mill, so we opted. There she is in all her glory, but it didn't look like that long. We like to weather things, like I said. So there she is, weathered up. I think this was taken to the narrow gauge convention, and it did pretty well there. A couple other projects we'll skim through just to kind of show that most of this was done about the locomotive, but after that we needed a caboose. Now you have a whole train. So
yeah. This is our first project on a laser. We bought a little laser. So this whole car was cut out of on our laser. It's all mixture of regular sheet wood and then like the real thin plywood.
I think it's a lot of Midwest scale lumber, plywood.
Yeah. Had a fully detailed interior. Everything on this car that you see in this picture is scratch built.
Yeah, including the seat cushions, which are padded, by the way, and you just have to take my word for it. But unfortunately, when we put it all together, I don't think the roof is removable on this, so you'll just have to take my word. The seats are padded.
This is the seat back frame for the cupola. Can't really get anything that is even close that I've found in our scale, so I had to make it. This is a jig. This, you put the straight piece, laser cut straight piece on here, you put the top over it, heat it up, and it actually gives it that contour that follows the seat back. And then that's kind of what it looks like sitting in the caboose.
Came out really well for, I think this was a first attempt, and it came out almost perfect. You can see some weathering done inside the caboose before we buttoned it up with the roof.
A little bit of the frame, basic same details. We're getting more into brass here because we don't want things knocked off or broken. So as much as we can do out of brass or non-plastic, we're doing, including in this particular model. These are one-off trucks, and my brother actually made strip brass and hand bent those trucks piece by piece, and we just had some detailed plastic castings we put in there. Here's all the grab irons and ladders and handrails that were all in-house made. None of that is commercially available. And then this is the caboose assembled and painted before any lettering or exterior weathering happened. I was on my honeymoon and we were trying to make a deadline for a convention. So my brother actually lettered this while I was on my honeymoon. And this is the only picture I have of it lettered. And he sent it to me while we were in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I should say this is mostly Casey's work. And so this was one of the first times I think I actually touched the car, was putting the roof on and doing the lettering. A little bit under detail there.
This is after it's been weathered, it's finished. And then that is the car on our somewhat layout.
And let's play the Where's Waldo game. Anybody see a 124 scale caboose? There she is right there, Colorado Railroad Museum. She got to visit the prototype.
Okay, and there's just a handful of pictures left. It's just some various other cars we made. Here's a good picture of some truck side frames we made. The rubber mold is just was this silicone or was it?
It is silicone. It's a clear silicone. So we actually found a company that makes, I think the company is called Smooth On. Some of you may be familiar with that. You can get with us if you're interested in that. But clear rubber, clear silicone rubber, and we use a clear casting resin as well. It just allows you to see through exactly what's going on during the curing process.
Mhm. These are some of the trucks we made. There's a 6300 series flat on the left, a standard arch bar on the right. You can see all the trucks in the background. This is the 6314 we made, took it to Chama. I don't even have a picture of it lettered, although it's been lettered for several years
Sitting
now.
above our head, I think,
Yeah.
somewhere. But we have a bad problem with not having things lettered when it's time to take it to Colorado. So this is a rail and tie car. And then Casey made a wheel and tie car. Some of these shots are dark, and I think, yep, there's one all painted up and weathered. So you can see the amount of detail you get to add when you're in a larger scale like this. Future model, this is a C25 frame that Casey's been cutting on. We acquired a full-size mill, so and with a digital readout, so we're able to actually plot points on the sheet brass. And
these are the rear frames. I'm cutting actually one right side up and one upside down at the same time. And then this is the frame set up. This is pretty much where we are on this project right now. It's even got the press fit sides. All the holes line up. A lot of time went into.
I should say most of the frames before this were water or laser jet cut. We had companies that would do that for us off of drawings that Casey made. This one is all hand machined with a just a mill and a cutter. So all done by hand, and it came out really well.
We recently acquired a 3D printer too. There's only a couple more pictures. Getting into it, still trying to figure out settings and stuff. This was some of the first train parts we printed off of this 3D printer. So these are actually not usable because of the quality that came off of it, just because I don't know how to set up the settings yet. But I just took this picture because it was the first stuff we made.
Definitely a learning curve when you're using a 3D printer, and we're figuring it out. So this was one of the first usable, we think, projects. Trucks with the metal wheel sets, and these actually assemble just like the real deal, and they're sprung
with plastic 3D printed springs. We'll have to see how those hold up to the heavier models, but I mean, it
was something we wanted to try
just to see if it would work. And it actually has holes where you could lubricate the bearings inside and all that too. So
I think
that's it.
That is where we are today. So take it away, Mark.
Okay, Cody and Casey, thank you very much for a great presentation on some amazing scratch building. It looks like a clinic is in order later on for a look at your outdoor layout. We do have a few questions. Steve Bradley says, do you guys make SP narrow gauge number plates?
We're not very good at multitasking. So when you start trying to model build, and then you try to do that, and it takes up a lot of space. Could we do it? Absolutely. Have we done it? No. Haven't done number plates in a while. I think we finally sold out some of our last RGS 20 plates.
Okay, Steve Hollenbeck.
Definitely get with us, and we'll see if we do that in the future.
Steve Hollenbeck asks did you not use bearings?
Inside the Locomotive journals, there are roller bearings. They are 1/4-inch axle. And I think it's only a 32nd of an inch outer or wall thickness on those bearings. They're roller bearings though in the drivers. In the rest of the tender trucks, pilot wheels, all of those are just a nylon or Delrin material. We just drilled a hole in and for some sort of bearing.
We basically ordered the smallest bearing we could find that would fit a 1/4-inch axle, and from a RC car supply, I believe, is where those came from.
Okay, Steve Hollenbeck has a comment. Nice pipe lagging. Beautiful. Keith Stamper wanted to ask, what brand of paint do you use?
That may have been one of our very last bottles of Flocal. So rest in peace, Flocal. When you get into a larger scale, we're learning you can get away with using spray paint from hardware store. Krylon, Rust-Oleum, some of the freight cars were actually painted with that. I don't think we've tried a Locomotive yet, and some of that may have been some testers paint, but I'm more used to the solvent based. I'm not as much into the water-based acrylic type stuff yet. So a lot of that is probably testers or Flocal.
Okay, Reiner said, do you learn all these different technologies by doing, or could you build on any formal training? Admirable anyway.
Basically you buy the tool and then you figure out how to use it. No real schooling. YouTube works wonders. I can tell you that. You can learn a lot from YouTube just watching somebody else do it, but you just got to get in there and be ready to mess up some stuff. For sure. You learn more by messing up than you do succeeding, I'd say.
There's also this hobby is full of really good people who will teach you things. I mean, Barry Bogues was one that taught us. He was the one that introduced us into casting. And then there was also people like my dad who got us into this. But this hobby is full of people that are willing to share information and how-tos and do things like clinics to teach you how to do things. And we did learn a lot from that. 20 years ago, YouTube wasn't as popular on model building. So there was a lot of things we learned just by other people telling us how or what they did.
And we've had our hands slapped several times by Mark for going long. So we did skim over a lot of things we wish we could talk about more, but
okay, we also had some comments, mostly accolades. Nice work, guys. Great presentation. Truly impressive craftsmanship. Photos just don't do them justice. What a fabulous modeling presentation. And finally, a last question. Since you've already have 340 tender behind your 318, are you planning to do a C19 340?
When we were younger, we wanted one of every locomotive. Now, when it takes 9 to 12 months to put one of these together, you realize you're going to have to shorten your dream. So do I want one? Absolutely. What will the future hold? Not sure yet, but right now we're going to get our hands dirty on this C25 project, try to have that for our NMRA National Convention coming up next August.
I will point out too that before that tender was behind 340, it was also behind 345.
So really you could build either, sure.
Okay, well, thank you, Cody and Casey. That was a great presentation.
Absolutely. That was fun. Thank you guys.
Thank you all.
Russ,